Joe came into my life at a pivotal stage when I was 12 years old. No longer a child, but certainly not a man. I was the only child of my parents, Gina and Charlie, who had had an amicable separation and later divorce. Despite the two households my parents ensured I was taken care of and their lives revolved around me. They had high expectations, but we had found an equilibrium that worked for us, and thus life had marched on simply for all of my childhood. So when my mother first brought Joe home to me, arm in arm, I was, to put it mildly, not thrilled. Who was this interloper who had come to dilute my mother's affections? Why did she even feel the need to date anyone? I had more than sufficient company, or at least I thought I was, with my excellent taste in cartoons and 12-year-old witty conversation. But once the initial shock wore off that my mother was indeed a more nuanced human being with actual needs, I became territorial, disagreeable, and just plain rude to this stranger. I remember the first time I saw Joe give my mother a chaste kiss outside the front door. I was on the second floor in a perch, and I immediately flew into a rage and ran away from home. Now please understand, my idea of running away from home at this time was rather rudimentary. It involved me leaving the house and walking 2 more houses away to sulk in the bushes. After some dreadfully long amount of time, that was probably more than 30 minutes, but less than an hour, I decided that my boredom outweighed my hurt at being replaced as the sole man in my mother's life, and I returned home. Despite this initial comportment and the obvious resistance I exhibited to Joe, he was unperturbed. He continued in his calm, respectful manner and began to quickly win me over. He likes to cook. Go play ping pong with me. He has the largest television I had ever seen, and we could watch all the new DVDs together. Much like a soon-to-be domesticated feral animal, I stopped snapping at the hand trying to feed and simply allowed him to occupy a void in my life I didn't know I had. And suddenly Joe was indispensable to me. He became not only my mother's husband, but the anchor and the foundation of our family. Even my biological father, Charlie, loved Joe and expressed that sentiment many times. Our strange family of 2 dads, a mom, and 1 incredibly lucky child formed inexplicably, but the end result was a blessing upon me. I came to know Joe well over the years. He was not a loud or demonstrative man. Instead, he was a creature of subtlety, deep musings, and a gentle spirit that preferred understatement. Mind you, this is in sharp contrast to the well-meaning yet sometimes frantic natures of his wife and stepson. How Joe came to decide that he needed to interrupt his peaceful, hobby-filled bachelorhood with a divorced mom and a needy stepson, I'll never know. I'm just grateful he did. Many people have often asked me after meeting Joe the first time, is Joe okay? He seems so quiet and withdrawn. Not at all. That's just our Joe. Quiet on the outside, but always contemplative, always listening, and always faithful. The greatest mistake in perceiving Joe Columbus would be to think him either simple or uninterested. Joe was neither. He was quite literally a genius, with a mind that enjoyed creation. He built professional quality musical instruments that were more commonplace in 18th century French courts than in even present-day music schools, and he played them beautifully. He practiced ikebana, the Japanese art of flower arrangement, and was a favorite of his teacher for his artistic flair. He excelled in the kitchen, a fact that many seated here today can attest to, directly and enthusiastically. He painted, he designed, he photographed. Yet in his typically humble, self-effacing way, he stored many of these artworks in the basement, away from any eyes but his own. At one point, he even tried to throw away many of his beautiful paintings before Gina saved them from the rubbish bin. They're now in our living room. Joe was, simply put, a Renaissance man. But more than his many skills, I think all here today would most remember him for the calming aura that he projected. He was a pleasure to be around. Do you have a lot to say? Do you like to hear yourself talk? That's great. Joe likes to listen, and he would love to hear your ideas. Are you quiet and introspective? Also great. Joe will join you in silent contemplation. Rare was the instance where anyone who came into contact with Joe left feeling anything but brighter, more restored, and more heard. For these and many other reasons, I love Joe. One of my dearest memories of Joe occurred just a few short months before he passed. At the time, Joe, Gina, and I were in a constant daily logistical war of doctor's appointments, treatment decisions, and prognostication around the future of our family. We had just finished another round of discussions on what path Joe's medical care should take. As happened often back then, I became impatient and heated, disappointed with the progress we were making on his health under the current standard of care. There was then and still is a phrase that comes often to my mind. 90% of male rage is helplessness masquerading as frustration. I often felt helpless in the face of Joe's and my mother's illnesses. The people who raised me, nurtured me, and ensured I always felt love were under attack, and I was seemingly powerless to help. We adjourned our grim meeting with me numbering the things I would do to move forward Joe's healthcare, despite the current negative trajectory of the whole situation. As I was walking away, Joe looked at me in his quiet way and did something that I had rarely heard. He got in the last word. He said, with no preamble, no explanation, "You're a good stepson." For the first time in many hours, I was struck speechless. It was not like Joe to express something like that, even though I knew he felt it deeply. The three of us had been toiling for years, fighting these health battles, and despite many glimmers of hope, we were clearly losing the war, and it was starting to feel like the end. In that moment, with those 4 simple words, all the work had been worth it. I had his approbation, and I knew that I loved him. He knew that he loved me, and he knew that I wanted to do my small part to repay all the goodness he had brought to my life. I wish I could have saved him. I think it's ridiculous that we wait for someone's funeral when they're gone to tell them how much they've changed their life for the better. If I can make one small request to all of you today, don't wait to tell your loved ones what they mean to you. Don't wait for the funeral. Do it now. Do it while they can hear it. The following is a letter I wrote to Joe 5 days before he died. I read it to him in the hospital while we were with Gina. This is it. Dear Joe, what do you say to someone who has completely and profoundly changed your life for the better, but who had no biological or moral imperative to do so? You married my mother and you received a son, perhaps not knowing at the time how much work and stress that would be. Despite the unexpected burden, you acquitted yourself marvelously and were one of the truly profound blessings of my life. When you first came into my life, you were unexpected, yet a pleasant surprise, at least after the initial shock. He already knew that. From those early days, you clearly loved my mother and took care of her. And even better for young Cullen, you indulged in my various new fads like ping pong, cycling, and eventually genealogy. You were neither a dictator nor a harsh guardian, although you could have been, and I certainly would have deserved it. Instead, as we grew together, you became more than that to me. You were a calming presence, a sage advisor, and a mentor in life's finer things. When you look upon my interests now, many of them were originally nurtured and inspired by you. In the end, you became my best friend. Over the years, I knew subliminally that I could always rely upon you. Now that I've seen people who don't have that blessing, I realize how truly wondrous and special that is. No matter what happened in my life, I always knew you would be there for me, often silently, always faithfully. I'm not sure if you've ever grasped what a seismic impact you've had on my life, so I wanted to write and remind you of that. Simply put, when I look upon my many blessings, having you as a father has been chief amongst them. Even more than the gratitude for how you've treated me, I am eternally grateful for how well you've treated my mother. You two were truly a match made in heaven. I'll restate what I said at my wedding. When I am a good husband to Yasmin, it will be because of the example I witness daily from my father, Joe, and how he treated my mother. When you get to heaven, I expect there will be a special table for those who have changed everyone's life around them for the better. You will be welcome to it and sat at the head. For these and the many other things you have blessed me with, I cannot begin to repay you, nor do I think you want repaying, but nevertheless I feel honor bound to ensure that your legacy lives on in my family and our actions. You can rest assured that you will live on in the morals and the lessons we instill in our children, just as you have instilled them in me. I love you very much. Thank you for being my father.
Gina and Cullen and Yasmin and Bishop Maikawa and Father James, all the people who are here, family members and friends who really did love Joe. I think we'll all agree that Cullen has so powerfully and beautifully articulated his love of his father, which just came from the gentle and humble heart of Joe Columbus. I think we can all agree, too, that in this wonderful man Still waters ran wonderfully deep. Deep in an election, deep in affective nuance, and above all, deep in faith. A faith that was demonstrated by his love for Gina, his love for the people around him, his love for his friends, and his love for God, his love for the church. He really reflected, as Cullen said, a gentle and humble heart. And he transformed people through that gentle and humble heart. Joe and I were born within 12 hours of each other, he in Anchorage and I in Hawaii. And we met one another at Gonzaga University and spent 54 years with a couple of breaks as very good friends and real good supporters of one another, each in our own way. We were genuinely, I think, friends in the sense of friends of the soul, as Newman would call it. And that's because of who Joe was, again, articulated so well by Cullen. What I'd want to say is, well, first humorously, how I got to know Joe was, Spitzer was being egotistical and Joe was being humble. In any case, I was looking at the results of a computer programming exam, and I noticed that this one guy's number was higher than mine, and so I went, who is that guy? And I had no idea, but later in the class, I ran into Joe, and just listening to him speak, I just had to say it. Well, was that you who scored the highest exam score in the class? And he went, just like that. It was like a humble wasn't a proud but it was a typical Joe and I just thought, I really want to get to know this guy. And this, of course, we became very good friends. But as I began to discover, there was so much beneath that exterior. Seems sometimes placid. Oh, always humble, gentle of heart, no question about that. Very patient. But I could just see, wow, deep within that man, he loved music and art. He did. He loved the intellectual life and literature, and he read good literature. And that was very key. And of course, above all, he loved God. He loved the Lord Jesus. He loved, truly, the church. He loved the Blessed Mother, as has been said so well throughout the day, the afternoon. And so we can see, in this complexity of Joe, I'll just give a couple of incidents that just reminded me of things that were so beautifully Joe-esque. The first, of course, is love of music. Anybody who knows Joe knows. He just flew into a kind of a deep but quiet ecstasy as he listened. And I could just empathize with him, listening to music with him. We did not have to exchange a word. We would just listen, and every once in a while he'd say, here's a new one from Schumann you may not have heard. I go, well, let's listen to this other one. He goes, nothing new for you, and in a nice way. And I'd always go, okay, let's listen to the Schumann. So, but he would just introduce me to these things, and there was a love of this music, and I could tell his contemplative spirit. I just delighted in him, delighting in the music, and I felt at peace just being with him there. No words, just music and Joe. And everybody who knows him knows that was enough. And people have already spoken of his capacity to play, of course, harpsichords and clavichords, but he actually constructed them. And these harpsichords and clavichords that he constructed were very, very precise instruments, but they were also works of art. You couldn't believe it as you just came up to this, and you could just see his precise mind, his discipline, his artistic character. You could just see it in the polish of the, and of the varnish and the polish of the surfaces on the harpsichord, as well as the precision with which they were made. It was pure Joe. It was just an effusiveness of beauty, as Father James, said it. And of course, in Joe there was intellectual rigor. I don't have to tell anybody that. No one delighted in talking about partial differential equations, linear algebra, and nonlinear equations more than Joe Columbus. And of course, I delighted in that too when I'd come along and say, well, what's new on the particle front? And what's new on the cosmos front? And Joe would take such interest and delight in the latest quantum theory and so forth. And we had a great time together. We were also intellectual friends. And Joe just, like I said, he didn't have to say too much, but what he did say was profound. And for that reason, there was intellectual rigor. But Joe was not emotionally deprived. Joe not only had in his empathy, in his eyes, in the very beautiful mannerisms that Cullen described, Joe had in him a deep affective understanding and empathy for people. He truly was, as Christ described himself, I am gentle and humble of heart. And I just always, when I was around Joe, I always thought, yep, he's just like Christ, gentle and humble of heart. And in that gentleness, there was deep appreciation and understanding. Joe read, as I said, a lot of really good literature. But it wasn't just that. It was his ability to, with a very pithy phrase, express his care, concern, compassion, and humble love for the people and the friends around him. Sometimes all Joe had to do was, with that knowing smile, just nod like that. That was enough. You got the whole message. Not only that he loved you, but he would definitely support you and care for you with his wonderful bride, Gina. I mean, the two of them were almost an empathetic, a caring compassion act that could not be duplicated. The third thing, of course, I don't have to tell anybody, was his faith. Joe had a faith that brought him, of course, to the Franciscan seminary. And not only that, but of course we knew his devotion to the Rosary, his devotion to the Eucharist, so beautifully described by Father James, his devotion to the church. And if you talk to Joe, he had read so much church history, but he loved it. He loved the church, he loved her history, he loved church architecture, he loved church art, he loved church sacred music, he loved the history, the traditions, the liturgy of the church. Joe was just I could tell he was deeply in love with it. He didn't have to say a word, though sometimes he really did say a word about his love for that church. We both knew together that without the church, where would we be? We'd be out in the dark, and we knew it. And, again, it was that faith that not only helped us, but the faith he wanted to share through his generosity, through his good work in philanthropy with Gina, and so much else. I just wanted to say the Lord expected us, I guess, to be long lost, long and good friends. We weren't lost for very long, just a few spaces there, and just a few thoughts, as Providence brought us back together. When I joined the Jesuits, I didn't even know that Joe, about 4 years after that he had become a Franciscan seminarian, had no idea. And yet at the same time, I'm walking down the streets of Rome, a very busy street, the Via del Corso. And as I'm going down, I see this guy in a Franciscan robe walking toward me. I go, that looks like Joe Columbus. Obviously, he was saying, that looks like Bob Spitzer. And we both turned at the same time. We both said together, Joe, Bob. And of course, yeah, it was Joe. And we became fast friends in Rome. And we kept in touch with one another. And then, as fate would have it, lost touch for a while I was teaching at Georgetown and at Seattle University. Finally, of course, I'm sitting there in an airport in the one of the lounges there, talking to my vice president for development and advancement in the airport, and I feel this shadow kind of in front of me. No words as usual. And I look up, Joe, and there he was. Hey, that's it. I said, oh, wow, Joe, so great to see you. And of course, the friendship resumed full bore. I got to meet Gina, who was so absolutely wonderful. I asked him, well, would you be a regent of the university? Of course, he became a regent of the university. Then I asked him, oh, gee, would you become a director of the Maggia Center of Reason and Faith, which I now run? He said, yes, I'll of course do that. And he and Gina wonderfully involved in all of these various things. But I'd be remiss if I did not say that Gina really brought Joe into the fullness of life, of joy, of faith. She took that deep, infused, glorious, gentle, humble heart of Joe, and she just made it come alive in 100 different social contexts that Joe would have never had the chance to enjoy. Honestly, it was Gina who just, one day I remember, Gina, I hope you don't mind me saying it, but one day, Joe he didn't really want to do speaking at an alumni event, even though he was a regent. He just, you go ahead and do it. And of course, Gina's right there. Joe, just do it. And he did it. And the minute he started doing it, of course he was wonderfully articulate, because he was wonderfully bright, because he had a wonderful capacity for language. He just had to summon the psychic energy to do it. And Gina was the psychic energy. But I have to say, Gina, too, you encouraged him into so many different things, so many dimensions of his religious life that even as a Franciscan seminarian, he did not explore. And the social dimension, the travel dimension, it was really, you made him come alive. I've never seen Joe happier. Yes, Joe was contemplatively happy, but when he was around you, he was kind of effusively happy. When he was around you, he'd actually express affection that he felt very deeply, but he'd express it explicitly. And when he was around you, yes, you brought out what I would consider all of his best qualities. You helped him to explicitize that deep inner world, that wonderful gentleness and humbleness of heart. You were the life companion he needed. He was never happier and never more solidly in his faith than around you. Last, I just want to say to you, Joe, I know you're listening to us, because if you're not in heaven, I'm in trouble. And the main thing, of course, is, Joe, we miss you terribly. Of course, Gina misses you terribly, and Cullen and Yasmin. Of course, too, Joe, we want you to be happy with the Lord in heaven, and so we let the Lord have his way. He took you at this time because he knows what he's doing, and most of the time I do not. And so, Joe, we mourn you, yes. We are happy you are with God. We are very sure of that. And of course, at the end of the day, Joe, as we hope that we're going to join together in the fullness of life, the fullness of music that will make every kind of music pale, the fullness of intellectual rigor that will make all earthly intellection pale, the fullness of the love of God and the glory of God that will make our hearts stand still. And when we're there together admiring this beauty that you have recognized since your youth, we'll know that the Lord provided it 1,000,000,000 times told lovelier, just as you saw and lived it. Joe Columbus, we will miss you, but of course we give you to God the Most High. Amen.
Please stand.